April 1945. Europe was already in ruins, and yet the most destructive chapter of the war was still being written. Across the Oder-Neisse line, the Red Army gathered its colossal strength. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers were massed shoulder to shoulder, supported by tens of thousands of tanks, heavy guns, and rocket launch. The attack began with a thunder that shook the earth itself. Artillery so numerous it seemed endless fired in a rolling barrage that lit up the horizon. The crack of mortars mixed with the rising howl of Katyusha rockets the infamous Stalin's organs, whose shrieking descent terrified even seasoned German troops. Villages disappeared in clouds of dust. Forests erupted in flame. The very ground shook as if it might split apart. For the Red Army soldiers, the sense was clear. This was the beginning of the end. Within days, the German lines at the Silo Heights began to give way. The once formidable Wehrmacht, now fractured and exhausted, had no reserves left. These final defenders were not the elite formations of 1940. Many were old men, boys, or foreign auxiliaries pressed into service. Yet they resisted fiercely, for behind them lay the German capital itself. Still, the Soviet tide was unstoppable. Soon banners of the Red Army could be seen waving on the outskirts of Berlin. Before we continue, if you truly enjoy the stories I create, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep history alive. Your screen will now slowly fade to black. That's intentional. Artificial light can disturb your rest, so let the darkness protect your sleep. Put on your headphones, turn on your fan for a gentle hum, pull up your blanket and get comfortable. Now, let us begin our story. Inside, the city chaos reigned. Streets filled with rubble were hastily turned into barricades. Anti-tank obstacles were welded from twisted steel beams. Entire families, their homes shattered by bombing, moved into damp basements alongside weary soldiers. The city was a fortress and a prison at once. Food was scarce, water lines were broken, and the constant drum of artillery grew louder each night. Rumors ran through the streets. The Soviets were already at the gates, and stories of their vengeance spread fear faster than any shell. In the midst of this, Adolf Hitler still clung to his illusion. On the 20th of April, his 56th birthday, he emerged from the depths of his underground bunker to make what would be one of his final public appearances. Frail, hunched, and visibly aged far beyond his years, he shuffled into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Waiting for him were rows of Hitler youth, some only 12 or 13 years old. They had been summoned to receive medals for bravery, though many had never yet faced the horrors of the front. Newsreel cameras captured the scene. Hitler's hand trembled so badly that he could not fasten the medals himself. The task fell to an aide. Yet, for the boys, this brief encounter with the Führer was a moment of awe. When he asked whether they wished to go home or to the front, they shouted together, "To the front, my Führer." It was a chilling moment, for most would soon be dead in the ruins of their own city. The tragedy of Berlin's last days lay not only in the destruction of buildings, but in the waste of its youth. Still, Hitler raged and declared that Berlin would hold. He spoke of betrayal of phantom armies that did not exist and of miracles that never came. Around him, the Soviet ring tightened. Allied forces in the West, meanwhile, had already reached the Elbe River. American generals like William Simpson and George Patton pressed for permission to seize Berlin before the Soviets. On paper, it seemed possible the only German army in their way was a weak formation under General Walter Wenck with few tanks and little ammunition. Even Wenck admitted that if attacked, his lines would collapse instantly. But the order never came. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, decided against the drive on Berlin. He would not sacrifice tens of thousands of men for the prestige of raising an American flag over the Reichstag. Instead, he directed his armies south to eliminate what remained of German resistance in Bavaria and Austria. Winston Churchill protested, warning that allowing the Soviets to take the capital would shape the post-war balance of power. His warnings would prove prophetic, but the decision was final. And so the fate of Berlin was sealed. The Red Army would storm the city alone, and its people would pay the full price. The thunder of artillery never ceased. By mid-April, Berlin had become a city suspended between life and death. Each day, civilians woke to the shriek of shells, the whistle of bombs, and the rumble of tanks drawing closer. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Smoke choked the sky and blackened the once proud skyline. Those who survived sought refuge in cellars, subway tunnels, and the enormous concrete flag towers built to resist Allied air raids. Inside these towers, tens of thousands huddled together. The Zoo Tower, the most famous, was designed to hold 15,000 during bombardment. By the time the Soviets reached the city, over 30,000 men, women, and children crammed into its suffocating chambers. Doctors worked in dimly lit hospital wards. Children cried in the darkness, while families shared stale bread and dirty water. The stench of sweat, dust, and fear was overpowering, but no one dared leave. Outside, the streets were a killing ground. Meanwhile, life above ground grew ever more surreal. Berliners still queued for food rations, even as shells fell dangerously close. Some women refused to abandon their place in line, declaring that food meant survival, and survival was worth the risk. There were tales of entire queues being struck by artillery. Those who remained alive simply brushed blood off their ration cards and reformed the line. Such grim determination spoke to both desperation and resilience. The propaganda machine continued even in these final days. Loudspeakers promised the arrival of miracle weapons, secret divisions, and counterattacks that would crush the Soviets. Yet on the streets, no such armies appeared. Instead, there were gray-faced veterans with hollow eyes, teenage boys clutching rifles far too heavy for their arms, and elderly men drafted into the Volkssturm militia. They wore mismatched uniforms, carried outdated weapons, and dug trenches across boulevards. The reality was inescapable. Berlin's defense was a facade built of fear and sacrifice. Hitler himself remained convinced that his presence in the capital would inspire one last stand. Inside the Führer bunker, beneath layers of reinforced concrete, he surrounded himself with generals, ministers, and loyal staff. But even here, the cracks were evident. His health had deteriorated sharply. His left hand shook uncontrollably, a sign of advancing Parkinson's disease. His face, once carefully maintained for propaganda images, had grown pale and swollen. Despite constant injections from his personal physician Theodore Morel, he appeared decades older than his 56 years. On the 20th of April the same day, he saluted the Hitler Youth. Hitler convened what would be the last major gathering of the Nazi hierarchy. In the claustrophobic bunker conference room, he shouted orders to divisions that no longer existed and demanded counterattacks that could not be launched. Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and others offered hollow assurances before quietly leaving Berlin to secure their own futures. The symbolism was stark, the ship was sinking, and its captain was delusional. Above them, Soviet long-range artillery began pounding the city. On the 21st of April, shells landed in the suburbs, the first direct hits on Berlin proper. The shockwave shattered windows and sent waves of panic through the population. Still Hitler ranted about betrayal. He convinced himself that General Steiner's units could launch a counter-attack north of the city. Orders were dispatched, though Steiner had neither the men nor the equipment to carry them out. When reality broke through, Hitler's fury erupted in one of his infamous tirades, an outburst that marked the moment many of his closest aides realized the war was lost beyond saving. As the Soviet pincers closed, Berlin became an island cut off from the world. Postal services stopped, telephones went silent, and the railways ceased to run. The water system collapsed, toilets overflowed, and buckets served as replacements in dark, crowded shelters. Disease spread quickly. Corpses often remained unburied for days, adding to the stench of the dying city. Yet, even amid this misery, many Berliners still clung to the belief that salvation might come perhaps from Wenck's 12th Army to the west, perhaps from a new wonder weapon, perhaps from divine intervention. None of these hopes would be realized. The Soviet tide pressed forward with unstoppable momentum. The stage was set for the final brutal battle that would consume the capital and bring the Third Reich crashing down in fire and ruin. The Soviets were not the only army drawing near to Berlin. To the west, the Anglo-American advance had surged across Germany with breathtaking speed. In early April, American forces trapped more than 3,000 German troops in the Ruhr, effectively dismantling the last major industrial base of the Reich. General George S. Patton's Third Army pressed into Czechoslovakia, his armored columns moving with the same aggressiveness that had carried him across France the previous year. By the 11th of April, units of the U.S. Ninth Army reached the Elbe River, a mere 50 miles from the German capital. At this moment, it seemed entirely possible that Berlin might fall to American hands. Patrols even established bridgeheads across the Elbe at several points, and tank crews believed they were on the threshold of the final prize. General William Simpson, commanding the Ninth Army, asked for authorization to push on. His request traveled up the chain of command to General Omar Bradley and finally to Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. The decision that followed would shape the map of post-war Europe. On paper, the path looked open. The only German formation standing between the Americans and Berlin was General Walter Wenck's 12th Army. Wenck, nicknamed the Boy General for being the youngest officer of his rank in the Wehrmacht, was competent and respected by his troops. Yet his army was little more than a patchwork force. Many of his soldiers were teenage cadets, pulled from officer schools, labor units, once tasked with construction, and exhausted remnants of broken divisions. They lacked tanks, air support, and the firepower necessary to resist a modern armored thrust. Wenck himself admitted that if attacked, his positions would collapse quickly. But Eisenhower was cautious. He had no desire to spill American blood in the rubble of Berlin. From his perspective, the war was already won, and it was better to secure southern Germany and Austria areas where a Nazi last stand seemed possible than to race for prestige. He also knew that agreements made with the Soviets placed Berlin in their zone of occupation. To capture it now would mean handing it back later after suffering enormous casualties. Eisenhower's message was clear: stop at the Elbe. This decision infuriated Winston Churchill. The British Prime Minister had long admired Eisenhower's leadership, but on this matter he feared a grave mistake. He saw clearly that the Soviets were poised not only to capture Berlin, but also to dominate Eastern Europe. In letters to both Eisenhower and President Roosevelt, Churchill argued that failing to take the city would leave the West at a disadvantage in the coming peace. His words carried a prophetic edge. If the Russians take Berlin, will they not claim to have been the overwhelming contributor to victory? Churchill's instincts were sharpened by unease about Soviet intentions. Once he had welcomed their involvement with the phrase, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." But as the Red Army established control over Poland, Hungary, and Romania, it became clear that Moscow had no intention of granting freedom to the nations it liberated. Churchill feared that if Berlin fell to Stalin, the shadow of communism would stretch far across the continent. In Moscow, Stalin read Eisenhower's messages with deep suspicion. Deception was second nature to him, and he assumed the Western Allies were as duplicitous as he was. He pretended to agree with Eisenhower that Berlin was of little strategic importance, hinting that his main offensive would focus on Dresden instead. But in secret, he was already preparing to unleash his two most formidable commanders, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev, in a race to seize the German capital. For Stalin, Berlin represented more than a military objective. He wanted the honor of crushing Hitler in his lair to claim the final symbol of victory. He also had practical motives. His intelligence network had revealed the existence of the American Manhattan Project. If German scientists or equipment related to atomic research were captured, it could accelerate the Soviet effort to build a bomb. To let the Allies seize that prize would be unthinkable. Thus, while Americans halted at the Elbe, the Soviets sharpened their plans. The stage was being set for the deadliest urban battle in modern history, one in which entire divisions would be ground to dust in the streets of Berlin. For the men and women trapped inside the city, the decision made in Eisenhower's headquarters meant that no Western army would come to their rescue. Only the Red Army was coming, and it was coming with vengeance. Stalin's orders were blunt. Berlin must be taken, and it must be taken quickly. On the 1st of April, 1945, he summoned Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev to the Kremlin. Both men were already legends, Zhukov, the iron-willed victor of Moscow and Stalingrad, Konev, the aggressive commander, who had driven his forces deep into Poland and Silesia. Stalin dangled the ultimate prize before them, the honor of capturing Hitler's capital. He gave no single commander full control. Instead, he fostered rivalry. Zhukov was ordered to strike directly across the Oder River from the east, while Konev would push from the south with his Ukrainian front. A third formation, Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front, would secure the northern flank. On a large operations map, Stalin drew lines showing their advance routes, stopping just short of Berlin. Then, with deliberate vagueness, he left the southern boundary open. The meaning was clear. If Konev broke through fastest, he might enter the city ahead of Zhukov. Stalin thrived on such rivalries. It kept his generals both ambitious and obedient. Both commanders prepared feverishly. Zhukov's plan called for a massive frontal assault across the Oder near Kustrin, supported by overwhelming artillery fire. His army would drive west, crush the German defenses at the Seelow Heights, and push straight into Berlin. Konev, meanwhile, would swing north, aiming to encircle the city from below. Between them, they commanded nearly 2.5 million men, thousands of tanks, and the largest concentration of artillery the world had ever seen. But Berlin was not undefended. In February, Hitler had declared it a Festung, a fortress to be held at all costs. The city was divided into defensive sectors labeled A through H, each commanded by a general or senior officer. Around the city, two concentric defensive rings were built. The outer ring followed the city's outline, while an inner line hugged the S-Bahn railway that circled Berlin. barricades, trenches, and anti-tank ditches scarred the landscape. Most imposing of all were the flak towers. These giant concrete fortresses, designed originally as air defense platforms, now became citadels. The zoo tower in the Tiergarten stood like a medieval castle, its walls 26 feet thick, its roof bristling with heavy guns. Inside, it could shelter tens of thousands of civilians. Hidden within its reinforced chambers were treasures of German culture. The bust of Nefertiti from the Egyptian Museum and sections of the Pergamon altar. To the Soviets, these towers would prove frustrating strongholds, immune to ordinary bombardment. Yet for all the defensive preparations, the Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self. Many frontline units had been destroyed in earlier campaigns. Berlin's defenders numbered around 45000, regular soldiers bolstered by SS units drawn from across Europe, Norwegians, Danes, Hungarians, even French volunteers. They were experienced fighters, but too few to halt the coming storm. Supplementing them were the Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth, some as young as 14, carrying Panzerfausts and old rifles. It was a desperate patchwork of forces facing an enemy that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Meanwhile, the civilians of Berlin tried to maintain some sense of normality. Trams still rattled down streets lined with rubble. Women queued patiently for food rations, often for hours, ignoring bomb craters at their feet. Children played among ruins while mothers whispered fearful warnings of what might happen when the Red Army arrived. Propaganda fed them horror stories of Soviet atrocities, rape, murder, looting. Whether exaggerated or not, such tales planted terror deep in the hearts of ordinary people. Many prepared cyanide capsules or pistols for the unthinkable. For the German soldier, the war had narrowed to two bleak options, death or capture. To be taken by the Soviets often meant starvation, forced labor, or execution in a distant camp. We no longer fought for Hitler or the Reich, one veteran recalled. We fought for ourselves, so that we might not die in a hole filled with mud. We fought like rats. On the 16th of April, the Soviet offensive began with a roar that echoed across Europe. At precisely 4:00 a.m., more than 4,000 guns and rocket launchers opened fire in the greatest barrage ever seen on the Eastern Front. Forests vanished, villages dissolved into dust, and the horizon turned into a sea of flame. Soviet searchlights lit the night sky, flooding the battlefield with an artificial dawn. T-34 tanks advanced with headlights blazing their silhouettes, cutting through the smoke. Yet the Germans were not broken so easily. General Theodor Busse, commanding the 9th Army, had anticipated the strike. He withdrew his forward units, leaving Soviet shells to smash empty positions. He had also ordered the floodplains before the silo heights to be drenched with water, turning fields into swamps that bogged down tanks. When the Soviet columns pushed forward, they found themselves blinded by dust, mired in mud, and exposed to deadly German artillery fire. The battle for Berlin had begun, and it would be far bloodier than even Zhukov expected. The Battle of the Silo Heights quickly descended into a nightmare. Zhukov had promised Stalin a swift breakthrough, but on the first day, his troops were mauled. Soviet searchlights that were meant to blind German defenders instead reflected off dust and smoke, dazzling the attackers themselves. Tanks churned into the flooded marshes, their treads sinking into mud. They became sitting targets for the dreaded German 88mm guns, which knocked them out one after another in fiery bursts. Infantry pressed forward bravely, but machine guns cut down ranks of men as they stumbled through the swampy ground. By nightfall, on the 16th of April, progress was painfully slow. Soviet losses were staggering, thousands of men and hundreds of tanks destroyed in a matter of hours. Zhukov, usually calm, was humiliated. He raged at his commanders, demanding renewed assaults. His rival Marshal Konev, advancing further south, was already making gains, threatening to outpace him. Stalin, who thrived on such rivalries, encouraged the competition. To Zhukov, the thought of Konev reaching Berlin first was unbearable. He pressed forward with even greater fury, throwing men and machines at the German defenses with relentless determination. For the defenders, the battle was equally desperate. General Busse's Ninth Army clung to the ridges of the Silo Heights outnumbered, but fighting with the desperation of men who knew their backs were to the wall. One officer described the Soviet onslaught. They came in waves without end. We fired until our barrels glowed red. When ammunition ran out, they overran us. The Germans fought well, but they were too few, and supplies dwindled rapidly. The struggle raged on for 3 days. Forests were leveled, villages obliterated, and the very earth turned to mud and ash. Soviet artillery never ceased. Whenever German guns silenced one attack, another wave followed. By the 19th of April, the Silo line was finally broken. The cost was horrific. The Red Army lost an estimated 3,000 men and over 700 tanks in those 3 days. But to Zhukov's victory outweighed sacrifice. The road to Berlin lay open. That same day, the 20th of April, long-range Soviet guns began shelling the city itself. For Berliners, it was a grim milestone. Their capital, untouched by artillery until now, trembled under bombardment. Windows shattered across the suburbs, and fires erupted in neighborhoods already scarred by years of Allied bombing. Yet even as shells fell, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the bunker above. To mark the occasion, he greeted children of the Hitler Youth in the Chancellery Garden, bestowing medals they would scarcely live to wear. Cameras captured the surreal image of the dictator, frail and trembling, smiling at boys no older than 12. For Alfred Czech, the youngest of the group, the moment was unforgettable. He had rescued wounded soldiers under fire, and now stood before the Führer himself. When Hitler asked whether he had been afraid, the boy whispered, "No, my Führer." Moments later, when the boys were asked if they wanted to go home or to the front, they cried out together, "To the front." The scene, intended to symbolize resolve, instead revealed the tragic futility of Germany's final days. Inside the city, defenses hardened. Barricades sprouted at intersections. Trenches were dug across boulevards, and anti-tank ditches cut through parks and squares. Folksturm militia, old men from the First World War, young boys barely in adolescence, were handed Panzerfausts and told to stop Soviet armor. Flak towers bristled with guns, their thick concrete walls promising resistance even against the heaviest bombardment. But morale was brittle. Many Berliners had already lost faith in victory. Some clung to rumors that Wenck's 12th Army would come to the rescue. Others pinned hopes on a last-minute wonder weapon to turn the tide. In the bunker, Hitler continued to issue orders to imaginary divisions, convinced that salvation was near. His generals knew the truth but dared not contradict him. By the 21st of April, Soviet vanguards reached the city's outskirts. T-34 tanks rolled into the suburbs, greeted not with cheers but with silence, fear, and gunfire. For Berlin, the battle was no longer a distant thunder. It had come to their very street. By the 22nd of April, Berlin was fully within the grip of war. Soviet armored spearheads pushed deeper into the suburbs, while artillery pounded the city in an unending storm. Shells tore through houses, shattered tram lines, and set entire blocks ablaze. Berliners huddled in basements, emerging only to find familiar streets unrecognizable, their landmarks reduced to rubble. The city's once grand avenues had become canyons of debris, where soldiers crouched behind piles of bricks and children darted between craters, searching for scraps of food. In the Führerbunker, Hitler convened another situation conference. It would become infamous. Reports arrived that General Felix Steiner, ordered to launch a counterattack with his ad hoc battle group, had no forces to commit. The divisions Hitler imagined simply did not exist. When told the truth, he erupted in a volcanic fury. Witnesses later described him trembling with rage, his voice cracking as he screamed accusations of betrayal against his generals, his staff, and even the German people. For those present, the outburst marked a turning point. The illusion of control shattered. They realized their leader was living entirely in a fantasy. Outside, Berlin's defenders prepared for street fighting. The city was divided into defense sectors, each assigned to an officer, with orders to resist to the last man. Intersections were blocked by anti-tank barriers. Buildings were rigged with explosives, and sniper nests occupied upper floors. The Reichstag, long since unused as a parliament, was reinforced into a fortress. Doors and windows were sealed with concrete firing slits cut into walls and surrounding streets mined. It would soon become the ultimate symbol of the final battle. Yet, despite the preparations, the defenders were pitifully weak compared to the Red Army. Around 4,5,000 regular troops remained, supported by scattered Waffen-SS units drawn from across Europe. These foreign volunteers, Scandinavians, Frenchmen, Hungarians, fought with grim determination, aware that capture meant certain execution or imprisonment. Supplementing them were perhaps 4,000 Volkssturm and Hitler Youth. Many were barely teenagers, clutching single-shot Panzerfausts as their only hope against Soviet armor. Among the civilians, despair and fear deepened. The constant bombardment left people exhausted nerves, shattered. Food supplies dwindled. Ration queues became scenes of quiet desperation. Women whispered to one another about the stories of Soviet soldiers, tales of looting and atrocities carried from the east. Some carried poison, determined not to fall alive into enemy hands. Others prayed that Wenck's 12th Army, rumored to be marching toward the capital, might yet bring salvation. Each rumor was clung to as if it were lifeline. The Soviets, for their part, pressed on with grim resolve. Zhukov and Konev drove their forces in a tightening noose. By the 25th of April, their pincers met west of the city, linking at Torgau on the Elbe with the Americans. Berlin was completely encircled. No reinforcements could arrive, no civilians could escape. Inside the capital postal service, stopped telephones, went dead, and electricity failed across whole districts. Water mains shattered under bombardment, forcing families to rely on rainwater or filthy wells. In shelters, overflowing buckets replaced toilets, the stench unbearable. And yet amid this misery, resilience endured. Women still queued for food, even as shells fell among them. Children still played in the shadows of ruins. Some Berliners clung to an eerie sense of normalcy, as though continuing daily routines might hold back the tide of destruction. But nothing could stop what was coming. The Soviet jaws had closed around Berlin, and the grinding, bloody struggle for the heart of the Reich was about to begin. The encirclement of Berlin sealed the city's fate. By the 25th of April, the Red Army had closed all approaches, cutting off every rail line and highway. The Soviet pincers from north and south snapped shut, and the city stood isolated, surrounded by nearly 2.5 million enemy soldiers. Inside, perhaps 2 million civilians and a patchwork force of defenders braced themselves for the final clash. The artillery bombardment intensified. Entire districts vanished under barrages that seemed to last without pause. Soviet commanders calculated that sheer weight of fire would break resistance before infantry moved in. Streets became oceans of dust and flamed the skyline, a jagged silhouette of chimneys and shattered domes. Survivors compared the noise to a storm of iron. Buildings collapsed into heaps of brick and timber, burying those who had not reached shelter in time. For the German defenders, survival meant adapting to a new kind of battle. They dug into ruins, turning basements into bunkers and upper floors into sniper nests. Narrow streets were transformed into killing zones, blocked by barricades of cobblestones and overturned trams. Every bridge was wired with explosives, every canal and railway embankment prepared as a final line. Yet there were too few men to defend every sector. Commanders shuffled units back and forth, plugging gaps with Hitler Youth and Volkssturm, often with little more than rifles and a handful of grenades. The flak towers became vital strongpoints. Their immense concrete walls shrugged off artillery shells that would have pulverized ordinary buildings. From their platforms, heavy guns swept the skies and streets alike, knocking down Soviet aircraft and blasting tanks that ventured too close. Within civilians, crowded stairwells and corridors pressed together in suffocating darkness. The Zoo Tower in the Tiergarten sheltered treasures of German culture alongside terrified families. Children slept beneath crates holding ancient relics, while doctors treated the wounded in makeshift hospitals echoing with the roar of guns. Meanwhile, in the Führerbunker, Hitler refused to leave. Reports of the encirclement did not move him. He insisted that General Weng's 12th Army was advancing to relieve the city, that Steiner's forces could launch a counterstroke, that a miracle was still possible. His staff knew the truth: these armies were broken, scattered, or imaginary. But no one dared contradict him directly. To do so meant dismissal or worse. Instead, they nodded in silence as he outlined phantom maneuvers on maps already irrelevant. Outside Berliners lived hour by hour. With water mains destroyed, people collected rain in pots and buckets or drew from shallow wells fouled by sewage. Food was almost gone. Ration queues stretched across streets under falling shells. Mothers whispered prayers as they stood waiting, unwilling to abandon the line, even as explosions struck nearby. One shell reportedly killed a dozen women at once. Those still alive simply brushed blood from their ration cards and reformed the queue. For the Soviets, progress came slowly but steadily. They advanced sector by sector, paying for each block with lives and machines. A Soviet correspondent described the fighting: "Our guns fire thousands of shells into one small square, then the infantry goes in. Every room is contested. Every doorway hides death." Soldiers called it the most brutal street battle they had ever known. By the final week of April, Berlin had become a vision of hell. Fires raged, unchecked smoke turned day into night, and the stench of corpses filled the air. The city was starving, thirsty, and broken, yet still resisting. The Soviets closed in relentlessly, and for those trapped inside, there was no escape. The Soviets pushed deeper into Berlin, and the city dissolved into a battlefield unlike any other. Tanks ground forward through avenues choked with rubble, their tracks grinding over debris and corpses alike. Infantry followed, close storming one shattered building after another. Every house became a fortress, every cellar a bunker. For the attackers, progress was measured not in miles, but in staircases, corridors, and courtyards. German defenders fought with grim resolve. SS units, many drawn from foreign volunteers, held their ground with ferocity, knowing that capture meant execution or a one-way journey to the Gulag. Snipers lurked in attics, picking off Soviet officers as they raised their binoculars. Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth waited in alleys with Panzerfausts, often firing from just a few meters away before being crushed by tank fire or buried under collapsing walls. Their sacrifices bought time, but did little to change the outcome. For the Soviets, the advance was both triumphant and harrowing. They knew they were writing the final chapter of the war, yet the cost was immense. Casualties mounted with each block taken. Assault groups, armed with flamethrowers, grenades, and submachine guns, cleared buildings one by one. Engineers blasted holes through walls to avoid ambushes at doors. Entire companies could vanish in an afternoon. One Soviet soldier later recalled, "We fired until our barrels burned our hands." They defended like madmen, but we had more men, more guns, more everything. Meanwhile, Berlin civilians lived through a nightmare. Basements that had once served as air raid shelters became tombs as buildings collapsed above them. Families crouched in darkness without food or water, listening to the crash of artillery and the thunder of tanks outside. The air grew foul, heavy with smoke and dust. Sanitation had collapsed. Makeshift latrines overflowed, spreading sickness. Corpses lay in cellars alongside the living, unburied for days. Yet people clung stubbornly to life, driven by instinct more than hope. Amid the chaos, stories of terror circulated. Tales of Soviet soldiers committing atrocities spread quickly, fueling panic. Some women prepared cyanide capsules, others clutched pistols or knives. Many hoped to avoid capture altogether, even if it meant ending their own lives. The psychological toll was immense. A city once proud of its order and culture now reeled in fear, reduced to survival at any cost. In the Führer bunker, Hitler remained increasingly detached from reality. His body trembled with illness, but his will clung to fantasies of salvation. He demanded reports on General Weng's supposed counterattack, though his generals knew Weng's forces were too far and too weak. When no relief came, Hitler's rage turned inward, blaming his officers, his allies, even the German people for betrayal. Those who witnessed his tirades understood that the end was near, but none dared defy him openly. For Berliners, on the surface, the end was no longer abstract. Soviet shells pounded the city center. Iconic landmarks burned. Government buildings crumbled. Ministries and theaters reduced to ruins. The Reichstag itself was already prepared as a fortress, its halls bricked up and reinforced with steel rails, awaiting the inevitable assault. Every hour brought the Soviets closer. By the 27th of April, the circle had tightened. The Soviets stood at the gates of the government quarter. The once mighty capital of the Reich had become a wasteland of fire and blood, and still inside the bunkers and barricades, men, women, and children prepared to fight on. By the 28th of April, the fighting had reached the very heart of Berlin. Soviet artillery pounded the government district with a fury unmatched, even by earlier bombardments. Thousands of shells fell each hour, reducing entire blocks to heaps of stone and twisted iron. Fires burned unchecked, casting an orange glow over the night sky. Amid this inferno, Soviet infantry pushed forward, block by block, their banners already prepared for the moment they could be raised over the ruins of the Reich symbols. Inside the Führer bunker, the atmosphere grew even darker. Hitler received word that Heinrich Himmler once among his most loyal lieutenants, had opened secret negotiations with the Western Allies. To Hitler, it was the final betrayal. Shaking with fury, he raged that those closest to him had abandoned the struggle. In truth, many of his senior officials were already seeking exits. Goering had fled, Himmler was maneuvering for survival, and others were simply vanishing into the chaos. Only a handful of fanatics remained unwilling or unable to face reality. Meanwhile, in the streets, German resistance continued with astonishing ferocity given the hopeless situation. Small groups of SS men barricaded themselves in government buildings, fighting room by room. Hitler used squads, ambushed tanks from sewer tunnels, their small frames barely able to lift the heavy Panzerfausts. Snipers fired from shattered rooftops, slowing Soviet advances by minutes, sometimes only seconds. For the attackers, it was a grinding war of attrition, where progress meant staggering losses. Civilians bore the worst of it. Water supplies had completely collapsed. Families queued at broken mains, filling buckets under fire. Food was gone. Starvation gnawed at children's faces. Sanitation was non-existent. Disease spread quickly, and the stench of unburied corpses permeated the city. Yet even in such misery, some clung to routine women cooking thin soups over makeshift stoves, children playing with scraps of rubble. It was a fragile defiance against the collapse of their world. The Soviets pressed harder. Stalin demanded speed. He wanted Berlin captured before May Day, the symbolic celebration of communist triumph. Zhukov and Konev drove their forces mercilessly pouring men into the grinder. Entire streets were flattened by artillery before infantry advanced. Soviet soldiers carried red flags, folded carefully in their packs, ready to be unfurled over captured buildings. For them, this was more than a battle. It was vengeance for 4 years of devastation and a chance to strike the final blow against Nazi Germany. In the bunker, Hitler's aides urged him to flee. A breakout plan was presented: escape to the south, regroup, perhaps even continue the war from Bavaria. Hitler dismissed it outright. "I do not want to wander in the woods," he said bitterly. He had made his choice to stay in Berlin, to die in Berlin. His generals could see that there was no reasoning with him. Orders continued to be issued to phantom divisions, but no one believed anymore. Above ground, the Reichstag loomed as the ultimate prize. Though unused since 1933, it had been turned into a fortress with bricked windows, reinforced cellars, and a moat-like anti-tank ditch. Thousands of defenders, many SS, were determined to hold it to the last. For the Soviets, capturing the Reichstag was both a military and symbolic goal. The struggle for its crumbling halls would soon become one of the bloodiest episodes of the battle and one of the most iconic images of the entire war. The 29th of April, 1945, the government quarter of Berlin was surrounded on every side. Soviet troops of the 8th Guards Army and the 3rd Shock Army battered their way into the Tiergarten, closing in on the Reich Chancellery and the Reichstag. The thunder of artillery echoed day and night, shaking the ground even inside the reinforced bunkers. Fires lit the horizon. The city center was little more than a smoking ruin. The Reichstag, once the proud seat of German parliament, had been transformed into a fortress. Its lower levels were reinforced with steel rails and concrete, its windows bricked up and fitted with loopholes. Outside streets were mined, and a water-filled anti-tank ditch shielded the approaches. Around 5,000 defenders, many from SS units, had dug in. They knew the building was a symbol. If it fell, the world would see the Reich crumbling in its very heart. To the Soviets, raising their flag above the Reichstag was a matter of honor. The first Soviet assaults came in waves. At dawn, artillery rained down on the Reichstag. Then infantry surged forward, storming across bridges under murderous fire. German machine guns tore through their ranks. Panzerfaust knocked out advancing tanks. Twice in the morning, Soviet troops forced their way into the outer rooms, only to be hurled back by grenades and close-quarters fighting. The building became a cauldron where every hallway, staircase, and chamber was contested with bayonets, pistols, and sheer desperation. Still the Soviets pressed on. Major General Vasily Perekatov's 79th Rifle Corps was given the honor of taking the Reichstag. His men fought floor by floor, smashing through walls with explosives when corridors were blocked. The battle raged all day. Machine guns overheated barrels, glowing red. German defenders fought with astonishing determination, knowing that surrender meant little mercy. Many fell where they stood, but they exacted a heavy price in Soviet lives. By evening, Soviet troops had forced their way into the upper floors. Amid the smoke and wreckage, soldiers carried folded red banners tucked beneath their tunics. At 10:50 p.m., two men, Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, scrambled onto the roof. Under a hail of gunfire, they planted the hammer and sickle flag upon the shattered dome. It was not yet secure, but for the men who saw it, the sight was unforgettable. The red banner flying above the Reichstag, symbolizing the fall of Hitler's empire. Later, the moment would be restaged, for cameras becoming one of the most iconic images in history. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler received news of the fighting with growing despair. Reports told him the Reichstag was under assault, that Soviet troops were within sight of the Chancellery. He dictated his last will and testament, naming Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and Joseph Goebbels as Chancellor. That night, he married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony witnessed by close aides. In the dimly lit bunker, as artillery thundered above Champagne, was opened for the final toast of the Third Reich. For the staff, the celebration felt ghostly, an eerie pause before the inevitable. Outside, the battle continued into the night. German defenders held out in the Reichstag cellars, fighting hand to hand. Soviet soldiers collapsed from exhaustion, only to be ordered forward again. By dawn, the Reichstag was a ruin, yet the red flag still fluttered above. The final symbol of the Reich had been claimed. The 30th of April, 1945. The day dawned gray, and smoke filled the streets of Berlin, trembling under the continuous hammering of Soviet artillery. In the government quarter, shells tore through stone and steel, while Soviet troops inched closer to the Reich Chancellery. The Reichstag was already under siege, its dome scarred by fire, and the red banner had been raised on its roof the night before. For those inside the Führer bunker, the sounds of collapse outside were the soundtrack to their final hours. Hitler rose late in the morning, gaunt and trembling. He had not left the bunker in 10 days. His entourage saw a man broken by illness, paranoia, and despair. Yet he remained fixed on one decision: he would not be taken alive. At midday, he summoned his staff to his study. Calmly, almost quietly, he declared that the time had come. He handed out cyanide capsules to his secretaries, instructing them on how to use them if captured. He then withdrew with Eva Braun, his companion of over a decade, whom he had married only the night before in a brief ceremony. Before retreating to his quarters, Hitler spoke once more to those closest to him. He thanked them for their loyalty and urged them to continue resisting. Few could meet his eyes. They knew their leader's words were hollow. The war was finished. Around 2:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva entered their private rooms. Outside aides waited in silence. Minutes later, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker's corridors. When the door was opened, Hitler was slumped, lifeless on the sofa, a pistol in his hand. Eva lay beside him, dead from cyanide. The bodies were hurried upstairs into the Chancellery garden. The bombardment above ground was relentless. Shells burst nearby. As aides poured petrol over the corpses, flames consumed them quickly, smoke rising into the sky, already black with soot. This was the dictator's funeral, not a grand ceremony, but a secret hurried cremation in the ruins of the city he had doomed. Inside shock rippled through the bunker. For years, Hitler had embodied the Reich. Now, he was gone. Joseph Goebbels, who remained with his family underground, declared that loyalty demanded he follow the Führer into death. Others wavered. Some plotted escape, disguising themselves as ordinary soldiers or civilians in hopes of slipping past Soviet lines. Still others sank into despair, drinking in silence as the artillery pounded closer. Above the battle raged on. Soviet tanks pushed into Wilhelmstrasse, spraying shells into every building suspected of harboring defenders. Snipers fired from upper floors only to be blasted apart by flamethrowers and grenades. Civilians trapped in basements heard the clash of battle directly above them, the rattle of machine guns, the shouts of soldiers, the screams of the dying. The once grand government district was now a shattered wasteland, every corner a scene of carnage. That evening, word spread through the ranks of both sides. Hitler was dead. For the Soviets, the news was greeted with grim satisfaction. The man who had unleashed war upon their land had perished in his own capital. For German soldiers, the announcement carried no hope, only confirmation of what they already knew: their cause was lost. Some fought on out of duty, others out of fear of Soviet captivity. But the last illusions had burned away with their leader's corpse. The 30th of April closed, with Berlin still burning, its defenders still resisting, and the Soviets still advancing. But in the bunker, where the war had been directed for 6 years, silence now reigned. Adolf Hitler, once the master of Germany, was gone. Only the ruins remained. May 1st, 1945. Berlin was a dying city, its government quarters smoldering under relentless Soviet assault. The Reichstag was in Soviet hands, though pockets of resistance still fought in its basements. The streets around the Chancellery had become killing fields, strewn with debris, burnt-out vehicles, and the bodies of defenders who had refused to yield. For most Berliners, hope was gone. Their Führer was dead, and with him, the empire he had built. Inside the Führer bunker, the atmosphere was suffocating. Hitler's death the previous afternoon had left a void no one could fill. Joseph Goebbels, who now carried the title of Chancellor according to Hitler's will, knew his position was symbolic at best. His loyalty to Hitler had been absolute, and he had no interest in surviving the collapse. That morning he dictated farewell letters filled with bitter denunciations of Germany's enemies and grim resignation about the fate of his people. At 4 a.m., General Hans Krebs arrived at the Soviet lines under a white flag. He carried Hitler's last testament and authority to negotiate. Taken to General Vasily Choikov's headquarters, Krebs attempted to plead for a ceasefire, or at least terms that would allow for an orderly surrender. Choikov listened coldly. Stalin's instructions were clear: no negotiations, no conditions. Only total and unconditional capitulation would be accepted. When Krebs returned to the bunker hours later, empty-handed, the last vestige of negotiation had collapsed. Goebbels understood what this meant. At midday, his wife Magda performed a final terrible act. One by one, she administered poison to her 6 children who were asleep in their beds, too young to understand what was happening. Their ages ranged from 4 to 12. Some aides later recalled the eerie silence afterward, broken only by the muffled roar of bombardment overhead. When the children were gone, Goebbels and Magda left the bunker. In the garden, near the spot where Hitler's body had been burned, they took poison themselves, or perhaps were shot by an aide at their request. Their corpses were quickly set alight. The most loyal family of the Third Reich perished within sight of the burning Reich Chancellery. Above ground, Soviet troops pressed closer. Their artillery pulverized the government quarter, while infantry advanced through streets that no longer resembled a city. Buildings collapsed in flames, and bridges across the Spree River were blown apart by retreating Germans. Still resistance persisted. SS units fought from the ruins of ministries and theaters. Hitler youth, armed with Panzerfausts, ambushed tanks at close range. Every block, every courtyard, every stairwell demanded blood before it changed hands. Civilians suffered in equal measure. With food gone, many boiled wallpaper paste for sustenance or drank foul water from bomb craters. The stench of death filled every shelter. Suicide spread like contagion, families swallowing poisoned soldiers, shooting themselves in basements, women stepping into the streets to meet Soviet fire rather than face what they believed awaited them. For the Soviets, victory was close enough to taste. Stalin demanded that the city fall before May Day's end, so that the triumph of communism could be celebrated not only in Moscow, but in the streets of Berlin itself. Exhausted Soviet soldiers who had fought from the Vistula to the Oder, and now into the German capital, pressed forward with the knowledge that the war's final prize was at hand. By nightfall, the German government in Berlin no longer existed. Hitler was dead, Goebbels was dead, Himmler and Goering had abandoned the city, and what remained of the Reich's military leadership was scattered or in hiding. Only small groups of defenders carried on the fight. For the first time in 12 years, Germany had no functioning leader. The Reich was leaderless, broken and burning. May 1st ended with Berlin in chaos, its people starving, its leaders gone. The next morning, the final surrender would come. May 2nd, 1945. At dawn, Berlin's final defenders knew the fight was over. Soviet troops had broken through every line of resistance, and the government quarter was surrounded entirely. The last surviving commanders faced the choice, annihilation or surrender. In the bunker, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defense, realized there was no purpose in further bloodshed. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, supplies gone, and what remained of his troops were scattered remnants. At 6 a.m., he made his way to Soviet headquarters to negotiate terms. Unlike General Krebs, the day before, Weidling carried no illusions. He signed a document of unconditional surrender, ordering all German forces in the capital to lay down their arms. The news spread rapidly. Across the shattered city, exhausted soldiers emerged from ruins with their hands raised. Groups of Waffen-SS who had vowed never to surrender finally threw down their weapons. Volkssturm and Hitler Youth wandered dazed through the rubble, still clutching rifles they had no chance of firing again. In some places, isolated pockets continued to resist either out of confusion or sheer desperation. But by midday, organized resistance in Berlin had ceased. The scenes were haunting. Columns of German soldiers stumbled through the rubble-strewn streets, faces hollow from hunger and exhaustion. Many were boys or old men, too young or too frail for combat, yet pressed into service in the last weeks. Others were veterans who had fought on countless fronts, now reduced to prisoners of war. Soviet soldiers herded them toward makeshift camps where thousands were crammed into open fields or courtyards under guard. For Berlin civilians, the surrender brought an end to the constant thunder of artillery. The silence that followed was almost surreal, a blanket of quiet over ruins still smoldering. Yet relief was tempered with dread. The Red Army had come to stay, and its soldiers were intent on vengeance. Looting was widespread. Accounts of atrocities multiplied rape executions, plundering of homes. Women of all ages were at risk. Some tried to disguise themselves as old. Others hid in cellars for days. Suicide remained tragically common, as many believed death preferable to what awaited them. The physical state of the city defied imagination. Streets were impassable, clogged with wreckage, overturned vehicles and corpses. Buildings stood roofless, their interiors exposed like broken skeletons. Fires burned unchecked for days, lighting the night sky. Water was scarce food, nearly non-existent. Millions of civilians were left to scavenge among ruins, bartering valuables for scraps of bread. Disease threatened to spread through the overcrowded shelters. Yet, amid the devastation, some Berliners felt a strange sense of relief. The bombing, the shelling, the terror of street battles had ended. For the first time in weeks, they could step outside without immediate fear of being caught in crossfire. Children played among ruins. Mothers began searching desperately for missing family members. Survival replaced ideology. The war was over, and rebuilding life, no matter how shattered, was the only goal left. For the Soviets, the capture of Berlin was a moment of triumph. Stalin received news of the city's fall with satisfaction. His marshals, Zhukov and Konev, had delivered victory, though at staggering cost. Estimates placed Soviet casualties during the Berlin offensive at more than 3,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Entire divisions had been bled dry in the fighting. But the prize was undeniable. The capital of Nazi Germany had fallen, Hitler was dead, and the war in Europe was within days of ending. On May 2nd, the Battle of Berlin officially concluded. What remained was not a city, but a wasteland, a silent graveyard of an empire that had promised to last 1,000 years and instead collapsed in 12. For those who survived, the nightmare was not yet finished, but one chapter had closed forever. The guns fell silent in Berlin on May 2nd, but the silence was uneasy. The city was a carcass of stone and ash, its people stunned, traumatized, and facing a future they could scarcely imagine. Soviet soldiers roamed the streets in victory, but for the civilians who encountered them, fear replaced the relief of survival. The Red Army had paid dearly for its triumph. In the 16 days of the Berlin operation, Soviet forces suffered over 3,000 casualties, with more than 8,000 dead. Entire divisions were gutted. Tanks and artillery littered the approaches to the city burned-out hulks that testified to the ferocity of the fighting. Yet the loss was accepted as the price of victory. For Stalin, the conquest of Berlin was more than military, it was symbolic. His flag now flew over the enemy's capital. The Soviet Union had avenged itself for the horrors of 1941. For the Germans, the surrender marked the beginning of a new torment. Soviet soldiers, many hardened by years of unimaginable suffering, exacted vengeance without restraint. Looting was rampant. Furniture, pianos, watches, even door handles were stripped from homes and carted east. More chilling still were the mass assaults on women. Testimonies describe entire streets where no female, young or old, was spared. Victims ranged from girls of 12 to women in their 70s. Some were murdered afterward. Others lived but carried lifelong scars. Many Berliners turned to poison pistols or nooses to escape their fate. The city itself was unrecognizable. Streets were cratered, sewers flooded, entire districts reduced to piles of bricks. The smell of unburied corpses hung over every block. Public services had collapsed entirely. No running water, no electricity, no transport. Food was desperately scarce. Families dug in the rubble for potatoes, scavenged abandoned Wehrmacht stores, or bartered valuables with Soviet soldiers for bread. Those with nothing to trade simply starved. And yet even in this abyss, life persisted. Children emerged from cellars, playing with shell casings and climbing over tank wrecks. Mothers, their faces drawn with exhaustion, tried to resume daily routines, boiling water, sewing torn clothes, searching for relatives. The human instinct to survive endured even amid devastation. Some Berliners welcomed the Soviets, cautiously seeing them as liberators from the Nazi regime. Others viewed them only as conquerors. Many feared what would come next partition of the city trials for collaborators' years of occupation. Already rumors spread that Western Allied forces had halted far to the west, leaving Berlin entirely in Soviet hands. To many, it felt like abandonment. Among captured soldiers, fates diverged sharply. Some Wehrmacht troops were marched eastward into captivity, facing starvation and disease in Soviet camps. SS men, especially foreigners who had served in Hitler's elite units, were often executed on the spot. Others tried to slip away in civilian clothes, hoping to disappear into the chaos. A few succeeded, most did not. On May 2nd, as Berlin lay in ashes, the world understood that Nazi Germany was finished. Yet the war in Europe had not entirely ended. Fighting continued in pockets across Czechoslovakia, Austria, and northern Germany. But for the capital, the war was over. The Third Reich had been extinguished in fire and rubble, its leader dead, its government dissolved, its people left to endure the consequences. In Moscow, Stalin celebrated with muted satisfaction. For him, Berlin was not only a victory over Hitler, but a warning to the West. The Red Army now stood in the heart of Europe, and it had no intention of leaving. The conquest of Berlin was both an end and a beginning, the close of one world war and the opening act of a new confrontation that would shape the second half of the century. In the days after Berlin's fall, the scale of the city's suffering became painfully clear. Soviet soldiers roamed freely through the ruins, some distributing rations, others plundering whatever they could carry. For many civilians, the reality of defeat came not only from hunger and destruction, but from humiliation at the hands of the conquerors. Women bore the worst. Survivors later recalled nights filled with screams as groups of soldiers broke into cellars and shelters. No age offered protection. Some victims were killed afterward. Others lived but with trauma that would shadow them forever. Amid this horror, suicides multiplied. Families gathered in kitchens or cellars sharing poison tablets or inhaling gas from stoves. Rivers and canals filled with bodies of those who leapt in rather than endure. One teenage girl later recalled, "There were 8 of them. I screamed until I had no voice. Afterward, I had no tears left. I only thought how many more are coming. When will it end?" Such voices were echoed across the city, whispered in diaries and spoken decades later by survivors, still haunted by April and May of 1945. The Soviet command tried to impose discipline. Orders were issued forbidding looting and assault, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some officers punished offenders harshly, even with execution, while others turned a blind eye. In truth, revenge was woven into the Red Army's advance. After 4 years of devastation in their homeland villages, burned families, slaughtered millions, starved many, Soviet soldiers saw Berlin as a place where vengeance was not only allowed but deserved. For them, justice meant retribution, and restraint was rare. Meanwhile, Berlin itself was barely habitable. Fires smoldered for weeks in the government district. The stench of death clung to the streets, rising from collapsed buildings where civilians still lay buried. Food was the most urgent need. Soviet authorities attempted to organize distribution, but chaos reigned. Civilians bartered heirlooms for a few potatoes. A watch could buy bread, a pair of shoes, a sack of flour. Those with nothing to trade starved or turned to scavenging from Soviet supply dumps. Water remained scarce. With mains destroyed, families relied on rainwater collected in buckets or drank from craters filled with filthy runoff. Disease loomed. Dysentery and typhus spread quickly in overcrowded shelters where sanitation had collapsed. Doctors did what they could with dwindling supplies, but their efforts were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of need. Despite the misery, fragments of normal life began to reappear. Children, resilient as always, played among ruins, their laughter an eerie contrast to the devastation around them. Mothers cleaned whatever remained of their homes, sweeping rubble from rooms open to the sky. Churches reopened, holding services in half-collapsed sanctuaries. Some Berliners even returned to work clearing streets and salvaging bricks for rebuilding. Life, however fragile, pressed forward. Politically, Berlin was now under Soviet authority. Command posts were established in captured buildings. Soviet patrols directed traffic at intersections once dominated by Nazi banners. Red flags hung over ministries and government offices. For many Berliners, this was a strange reversal from Hitler's swastika to Stalin's hammer and sickle in a matter of days. Fear of the Gestapo had given way to fear of the occupiers, but fear remained constant. For the Soviets, the capture of Berlin was more than victory. It was a demonstration of power to their Western allies. Reports of atrocities were downplayed or dismissed, while official propaganda celebrated the triumph. Photographs of the flag raised over the Reichstag circled the globe, cementing the image of Soviet supremacy. In Moscow, May Day was celebrated with parades and speeches proclaiming that the Red Army had avenged its homeland and delivered justice upon fascism. In Berlin, however, the reality was more complicated. To the millions of civilians left behind, the end of the war did not bring peace. It brought survival in a new kind of captivity. The Reich had fallen, but the suffering of its people had only entered another chapter. In the weeks that followed Berlin's surrender, the ruins of the city became a stage for the victors. Soviet commanders established headquarters in the least damaged buildings, while patrols directed traffic through streets still choked with rubble. Red flags appeared over ministries, railway stations, and monuments, their bright color stark against the gray ash of the devastated capital. For the Soviets, this was the crowning symbol of their victory, the transformation of Hitler's citadel into a conquered outpost of their own empire. The human cost, however, was staggering. Historians estimate that between 80000 and 120000 civilians perished in the battle for Berlin. Many of them from starvation, disease, suicide, or the relentless bombardment. Entire neighborhoods had been obliterated. Families were torn apart. Children wandered alone, searching for parents who would never return. Hospitals were overwhelmed, their corridors filled with the wounded, the sick, and the dying. Supplies of medicine were exhausted. Doctors resorted to crude improvisations, using rags as bandages and boiling contaminated water to wash wounds. The occupying forces divided responsibilities. Soviet military authorities imposed martial law, seizing control of transport, food, distribution, and communications. Civilians were ordered to clear rubble, often under armed guard. Survivors remembered the eerie quiet of those days, broken only by the sound of shovels, scraping stone, and trucks hauling away bodies. Every courtyard, every cellar, seemed to conceal another corpse. It would take months before the dead were buried properly, and even then, mass graves dotted the city like open wounds. Amid this devastation, Berlin's cultural treasures were scattered or stolen. Museums had been looted either by German officials attempting to hide artifacts or by Soviet troops claiming them as spoils of war. Priceless works of art disappeared into crates bound for Moscow. Some would reappear decades later. Others were lost forever. To Berliners, this pillaging felt like another layer of humiliation, the stripping not just of possessions, but of their very history. And yet, amid despair, survival instincts reasserted themselves. Black markets sprang up almost instantly. Cigarettes became currency, traded for food, clothing, or favors. Women bartered jewelry for bread or a few potatoes. Farmers from nearby villages smuggled goods into the city, exchanging them for whatever valuables Berliners could spare. A fragile makeshift economy began to function in the ruins. For the Soviet soldiers, victory was a paradox. Many had dreamed of this moment for years, but when it came, it brought exhaustion rather than joy. They had lost friends and comrades by the tens of thousands in the assault. Letters home spoke less of triumph and more of relief that the struggle was finally over. Yet discipline remained uneven. Acts of kindness, sharing rations with hungry children, existed alongside cruelty, looting, and violence. Berlin was not only a conquered city, it was a mirror of human extremes, reflecting the best and worst of its occupiers and inhabitants alike. The Western Allies halted at the Elbe, watched events with unease. Reports of Soviet brutality filtered through, confirming Churchill's fears about the consequences of allowing Stalin to seize the capital. Berlin, once the beating heart of Hitler's Reich, was now the fault line of Europe. Its ruins foreshadowed a division that would soon crystallize into the Cold War. For Berliners in May 1945, however, geopolitics mattered little. Their world had collapsed. The Reich was gone, their leader dead, and survival depended on scavenging, adapting, and enduring. In a city of rubble, life continued in fragile, painful steps. By mid-May 1945, the echoes of artillery had faded, but Berlin was a city of ghosts. Rubble filled the streets where trams once ran, landmarks stood roofless and shattered, and survivors wandered like shadows amid the ruins. Every district bore scars of fire and bombardment. Some blocks were flattened entirely, others left as hollow shells facades without interiors. For Berliners, daily life was now a matter of improvisation, endurance, and sheer will. Food was the first crisis. The city's supply system had collapsed entirely. With shops looted or destroyed, families turned to whatever could be found: potatoes dug from abandoned gardens, horse meat from dead animals lying in the streets, or watery soups made from weeds and scraps. Soviet field kitchens distributed rations in some areas, but distribution was chaotic and often arbitrary. Hunger became the defining experience of survival, gnawing at children and the elderly alike. Shelter posed another challenge. Entire families who had lost their homes slept in cellars, subway tunnels, or makeshift huts assembled from debris. Fires burned in barrels to provide warmth during cold nights. The smell of smoke mixed with that of decay. Corpses were still being recovered daily from collapsed buildings. Disease followed close behind. Dysentery spread through communities with no access to clean water, and medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Hospitals, though still standing, were overwhelmed. Surgeons operated without anesthesia. Nurses improvised bandages from bedsheets. The psychological wounds were just as deep. Women who had endured assault often spoke of themselves as living in a second death. Some never revealed their trauma, carrying it silently for decades. Men returned from the front to find their families destroyed, their homes gone, and their city unrecognizable. Children grew up amid ruins, playing among burned-out tanks and unexploded shells, their innocence hardened by what they had seen. Amid the misery, survival mechanisms emerged. Barter became the lifeline of the city. Watches, jewelry, and silverware were traded for bread or boots. Cigarettes, scarce and precious, became a currency of their own, exchanged for food, alcohol, or protection. Women sometimes entered survival marriages with occupying soldiers seeking safety or rations for themselves and their families. These arrangements, controversial and often resented, reflected the brutal choices forced by starvation. The occupying Soviets began imposing order. Patrols directed civilians to clear rubble and reopen essential services. Red Army banners hung from government buildings while loudspeakers blared announcements in Russian and German. Officially, the Soviet command promised reconstruction and aid. In reality, control was inconsistent. Some units enforced discipline, strictly protecting civilians and punishing looters within their own ranks. Others continued to plunder at will. For Berliners, every encounter with Soviet soldiers was unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes brutal, always a reminder of defeat. Beyond survival, there was the question of identity. For 12 years, Berlin had been the showcase of Nazi power. Now its symbols lay in ruins. The swastikas were torn down, replaced with hammers and sickles. Propaganda posters of Hitler rotted in the rain, trampled under the boots of conquerors. People whispered of trials, of retribution, of how blame for the war would be assigned. Few admitted loyalty to the regime anymore. Survival demanded silence, adaptability, and forgetting. In this shattered city, life went on. Mothers carried buckets of water through ruins. Children scavenged wood for fuel. Men returned from captivity or emerged from the rubble, gaunt and dazed, searching for family. Out of devastation, a rhythm of survival took hold, fragile but persistent. The Reich had fallen, but Berlin endured, scarred yet alive. June 1945. A month after Berlin's surrender, the city was still a landscape of devastation. Whole districts lay silent, broken skeletons of once proud neighborhoods. Roads were choked with rubble, bridges collapsed into rivers, tram lines twisted and useless. At night, the ruins glowed faintly from smoldering fires that had never fully gone out. For many Berliners, it felt as though time itself had stopped in the ruins of April. Everyday survival remained an exhausting struggle. Food was desperately scarce. Soviet rations, when distributed, were meager, sometimes just a piece of bread and watery soup. People turned to the black market, trading whatever valuables they had salvaged. A wedding ring might buy a few potatoes, a fur coat could be exchanged for a sack of flour. Cigarettes, rare and prized, became the city's unofficial currency. Those with nothing to barter often starved, or relied on foraging in gardens and fields outside the city, walking miles through dangerous countryside to find food. Water remained a daily challenge. Families lined up at public pumps, often broken or dry-filling buckets to carry back through the ruins. Children were sent with tins and jugs, weaving through shell craters to bring water home. Sanitation was nearly impossible. The stench of waste mixed with the odor of corpses still being uncovered in collapsed buildings. Outbreaks of dysentery and typhus were common. Doctors and nurses, many exhausted and malnourished themselves, worked with almost no supplies. Berlin's population lived under the shadow of occupation. The Soviet command had established martial law. Curfews restricted movement after dark. Patrols roamed the streets, sometimes offering protection, other times extorting or harassing civilians. Encounters were unpredictable. One soldier might share bread with a child, another might plunder or assault with impunity. Fear remained a constant companion, shaping every decision. Amid the hardship, fragments of normal life began to re-emerge. Schools reopened in makeshift classrooms, though many children had no books or pens. Churches held services in shuttered sanctuaries, their congregations huddled beneath cracked ceilings. Families scavenged bricks and timber to repair shelters. Even laughter returned at times, children playing amid the wreckage, inventing games with discarded helmets or shell casing. For adults, such moments were bittersweet reminders of what had been lost. Politically, the city's future was uncertain. Rumors circulated about Allied plans to divide Berlin. Many civilians hoped that the Western powers, Americans, British and French, would arrive soon, bringing order and relief. For now the Soviets ruled unchallenged. Red flags flew over the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate, stark symbols of a new reality. To many Berliners, it felt like trading one dictatorship for another, though most were too exhausted to care about politics. Survival eclipsed ideology. The psychological wounds of defeat ran deep. Few spoke openly of Hitler or the Reich anymore, except in whispers. Those who had believed in victory struggled with disillusionment. Those who had doubted all along carried guilt and silence. The city lived in a fog of trauma. Diaries from the time reveal voices overwhelmed by despair, but also by resilience. One Berliner wrote, "We are living like shadows, but we are alive. That is all that matters now." The battle for Berlin had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. Hunger, disease, occupation, and uncertainty defined life in the ruins. The war was over yet, for Berlin peace was still a distant dream. Summer 1945. Berlin was no longer a battlefield, but the scars of war were everywhere. The city's population, once millions strong, had been cut nearly in half by death evacuation and flight. Those who remained lived amid ruins that stretched as far as the eye could see. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened, leaving only foundations and broken chimneys standing like gravestones. The survivors began the slow process of digging out clearing rubble with bare hands and searching for anything salvageable. The Soviets consolidated their control. Military command posts were established in former government buildings, and Russian was heard as often as German in the streets. Propaganda posters went up, declaring friendship between peoples, though few Berliners believed the slogans. Patrols enforced strict curfews. Looting was punished harshly, in some cases ignored in others. The Red Army both fed and terrorized the population, distributing bread in the morning, then stripping homes of valuables at night. To Berliners, occupation meant both protection and oppression, often in the same breath. The psychological burden was immense. Many civilians still lived with the trauma of the final battle, the screams, the bombardments, the rapes. Entire families had been destroyed. Those who survived carried deep scars. Women spoke of themselves as living dead men returned from captivity, broken in body and spirit, and children grew up with memories of starvation and violence as their earliest experiences. Suicide remained common, especially among women who feared or had already endured assault. In some districts, entire apartment blocks seemed emptied by despair. Amid the devastation, new routines emerged. Barter thrived in open-air markets, set up amid ruins. A cigarette could buy a loaf of bread, a gold ring might fetch a sack of potatoes. Farmers from the countryside brought goods into the city, trading them for clothes, tools, or jewelry. Hunger remained constant, but a fragile economy began to reappear. Women, often widows or mothers, became the backbone of survival, managing households, scavenging for food, and negotiating at markets. Children adapted in ways both tragic and resilient. Many were orphans, living in packs, scavenging and stealing to survive. Some became known as wolf children, sleeping in abandoned buildings and roaming the countryside. Yet children also showed remarkable resilience, playing among wrecks, climbing into burned-out tanks, collecting shell casings as toys. Their laughter echoed strangely in a city otherwise silent with grief. Politically, Berlin's future shifted rapidly. In July, the Allies gathered at Potsdam, not far from the city, to decide Germany's fate. It was agreed that Berlin would be divided into 4 zones: Soviet, American, British, and French. Though still under Soviet occupation, Berliners began to hear rumors that Western forces would soon arrive. For many, it sparked fragile hope that perhaps life would improve under Western authority, that perhaps the hunger and fear might ease. But beneath those hopes lay uncertainty. What would happen to former Nazis, to collaborators, to ordinary citizens who had lived under Hitler's regime? Trials were promised, purges announced, yet the lines between guilt and survival blurred in the ruins. For now, Berlin lived in limbo, caught between defeat and reconstruction, between despair and the faintest glimmer of recovery. Through the summer heat, the city smelled of ash, sewage, and decay. Yet flowers bloomed among the rubble, stubborn weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement. Life, however fragile, asserted itself. Berlin was down, but not dead, and its people, scarred, starving, but unbroken, were beginning the long climb back from catastrophe. By late summer 1945, Berlin had become both a symbol of total defeat and a laboratory for what the post-war world would look like. The city was divided into sectors, though at first the Soviets remained the sole authority. Their rule was heavy-handed food rationing, curfews, mandatory work, details to clear rubble, but also strangely fragile. Rumors spread daily about when the Americans, British, and French would arrive, and many Berliners pinned their hopes on this change of occupiers. The physical labor of clearing the city fell largely on women. Known later as the Trümmerfrauen or rubble women, they worked with picks and shovels, stacking bricks from collapsed buildings, salvaging wood and carting debris in hand barrows. Many were widows or wives of soldiers killed or captured. Their work was exhausting, but it gave them purpose and became a symbol of resilience. Photographs of women in scarves and aprons hauling stones from mountains of ruins would come to define the spirit of Berlin's survival. Yet behind the images of determination lay continuing misery. Hunger remained constant. Ration cards often promised more than they delivered. A day's allowance might be a slice of bread, a potato, and watery soup. People grew gaunt. Children suffered from malnutrition. Those with relatives in the countryside sometimes risked dangerous journeys to barter for food, carrying jewelry or clothes, to exchange for flour and eggs. Many never returned ambushed by deserters or bandits who prowled the road. The atmosphere in Berlin was one of both exhaustion and tension. With the regime gone, old rules had collapsed, but new ones were not yet clear. Black markets thrived openly. Streets once patrolled by Nazi police were now crowded with traders selling cigarettes, coffee, and stolen Soviet supplies. Soldiers bartered weapons for watches or liquor. A single cigarette might buy a tram ride or even a night's lodging. In this world of scarcity, crime flourished, but so too did ingenuity. Cultural life flickered back to life amid ruins. Churches reopened, offering solace to congregations who had survived both bombing and occupation. Theater troupes staged plays in half-destroyed halls, sometimes performing by candlelight. Musicians salvaged instruments from wrecked homes, playing concerts for audiences who listened with tears, grateful for even a momentary escape. These gatherings were fragile, often interrupted by power cuts or raids, yet they signaled that the human spirit had not been extinguished. The Soviet authorities, meanwhile, moved quickly to establish political control. Communist leaders exiled during the Nazi era returned under Soviet protection. They began organizing committees, distributing propaganda, and presenting themselves as Germany's future. To many Berliners, their speeches meant little. The immediate concern was not ideology, but bread, water, and shelter. Still, the seeds of a new order were being planted in the rubble. Berlin was now a city suspended between past and future. The 1,000-year Reich had collapsed in a matter of days. What lay ahead was uncertain division trial, perhaps renewal, but no one doubted that life would never return to what it had been. Amid the ruins, Berliners carried buckets of water, cleared bricks, and lined up for rations, surviving from one day to the next. The war was over, but for Berlin, the struggle to live had only just begun. Autumn 1945. Berlin remained a city of rubble, but it was no longer solely under Soviet control. In July and August, British, American, and French forces entered their designated sectors, carving the city into 4 zones. The arrival of Western troops transformed the atmosphere. For many Berliners, their presence brought a measure of relief. Compared to the unpredictable behavior of Soviet soldiers, the Western allies seemed disciplined, organized, even generous. Chocolate bars from American rations and British tea tins became symbols of hope in a city starving for both food and dignity. Yet the division also foreshadowed the fault lines of a new world. The Soviets maintained their grip in the East, pushing communist authorities into power. In the West, democratic parties were encouraged to reform newspapers, reopen, and cautious talk of rebuilding a different Germany began. Berlin, though destroyed, was already becoming the epicenter of global rivalry, a front line between 2 visions of the future. For civilians, daily life remained punishing. Food shortages persisted, rationing was strict, and winter approached with terrifying inevitability. Coal was scarce. Families tore apart abandoned buildings for firewood, stripping doors, window frames, and floorboards. The cold seeped into every corner of the city. Children huddled in blankets, mothers boiled watery soups, fathers returned from captivity, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Survival meant endurance, nothing more. The black market grew into a lifeline. In makeshift markets across the ruins, cigarettes, coffee, and chocolate were traded for bread, potatoes, or clothing. American and British soldiers often supplied these goods deliberately, or otherwise fueling an underground economy that kept thousands alive. In a city where money had lost meaning, barter became the true currency of survival. The rubble women, Trümmerfrauen, remained central to the city's recovery. Organized into work brigades, they cleared entire streets, brick by brick, stacking usable stones for reconstruction. Their hands blistered and bled, yet they carried on, reshaping the skeleton of their city with perseverance. To many Berliners, these women became the quiet heroines of post-war survival, embodying the will to endure when everything else had collapsed. Amid destruction, culture flickered cautiously back. Concerts were performed in bombed-out halls, poetry readings held in cellars, churches filled with mourners and survivors alike. For a population numbed by trauma, these moments offered brief escape reminders of humanity beyond hunger and rubble. A theater performance, a hymn, even a child's drawing on a wall could kindle hope in the ruins. Still shadows lingered. Former Nazis lived quietly among the population, some hiding their past, others preparing for trials to come. Displaced persons, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, and others, who had been forced laborers under the Reich, wandered the streets waiting for repatriation or a chance to leave. The city was a crossroads of the broken, where victors, victims, and perpetrators lived uneasily side by side. Berlin in late 1945 was a paradox, destroyed yet alive, occupied yet leaderless, starving yet stubbornly enduring. It stood as both a warning and a beginning, the ruins of one world order and the fragile foundations of another. Winter 1945 descended upon Berlin with a cruelty that rivaled the battle itself. Snow fell over ruins that offered little shelter against the biting cold. With roofs gone and walls blown apart, many homes were nothing more than shells. Families crowded into cellars, draping blankets across broken windows, burning whatever wood they could salvage, furniture doors, floorboards, to keep from freezing. Coal was almost impossible to find. People scavenged endlessly, pulling splintered beams from wrecks and chopping them into makeshift firewood. Food was scarcer still. Rations provided by the occupying powers barely sustained life. A few ounces of bread, some margarine, an occasional potato. Malnutrition was everywhere. Children's faces grew gaunt, their ribs visible beneath ragged clothes. Many Berliners called it the hunger winter, the winter of hunger. The black market became the only reliable source of survival. Cigarettes, chocolate, or even soap could be traded for food. Allied soldiers, particularly Americans and Britain, sometimes gave out supplies, gestures that Berliners remembered for decades afterward. Despite the misery, Berliners displayed remarkable resilience. Women lined up in the freezing cold to collect water from public pumps. Children dragged sledges filled with firewood through the snow, and men returning from captivity joined the endless work of clearing rubble. Rubble women chipped ice from bricks, their breath steaming in the frosty air. Day after day they built neat stacks of salvaged stone mute monuments to endurance amid collapse. The occupation authorities tried to restore order. Soviet officials controlled the eastern sector with heavy surveillance, while Western allies in their zones emphasized food relief and cautious steps toward democracy. Political parties slowly re-emerged, though closely monitored. Newspapers reappeared, often printed on scraps of salvaged paper. Even these fragile signs of civil life gave people something to cling to, a reminder that Berlin was more than ruins, that it might one day be a city again. Cultural sparks flared in unexpected places. Musicians played concerts in freezing churches. Actors performed in cellars by candlelight, their voices echoing against damp stone. The audiences, bundled in coats and scarves, wept quietly grateful for even an hour of escape. Churches filled with prayers not only for the dead but for warmth, bread, and survival through the winter. Amid hardship, the geopolitical shadow lengthened. The Western Allies and Soviets eyed one another warily, their cooperation already fraying. Berlin, at the heart of occupied Germany, was becoming the focal point of this new tension. Ordinary Berliners sensed the shift even if they lacked the words for it. The war was over, but another conflict was already beginning, one that would not be fought with tanks and artillery, but with ideology, espionage, and influence. For those living through it, such thoughts mattered little. Each day was a struggle against cold, hunger, and despair. Yet, even in the darkest weeks, life refused to vanish. Mothers sang lullabies to children curled on straw beds. Neighbors shared scraps of food. Families marked Christmas with candles and whispered prayers. Berlin had been bombed, burned, and broken, but its people, scarred and hollow-eyed, clung stubbornly to existence. Spring 1946 brought the first fragile signs of recovery to Berlin, though the city still resembled a vast graveyard. Rubble dominated every street, piled into mountains that dwarfed the figures of the women clearing it away. Yet amid the devastation, shoots of new life emerged, markets reopened, schools resumed, lessons in ruined buildings, and families planted vegetables in vacant lots where houses once stood. The rhythm of survival slowly began to transform into the rhythm of rebuilding. Food remained the defining struggle. Rations were small and often irregular. Bread was coarse, made with fillers, and meat was almost non-existent. Malnutrition left children stunted, and many adults suffered from weakness and illness. Still, the black market continued to bridge the gap. Cigarettes retained their role as currency, traded openly in Tiergarten and Alexanderplatz, where ragged stalls sold everything from smuggled American chocolate to Soviet army boots. Some Berliners resented the shadow economy, but most relied on it. Without it, many would not have survived. Politically, the city reflected the emerging divide in Europe. In the Soviet sector, communist authorities consolidated power, reorganizing schools and workplaces along socialist lines. Political opponents were silenced, sometimes disappearing overnight. In the Western sectors, Americans, Britons, and French encouraged democratic parties and supported local self-governance, though always under Allied supervision. This duality was stark. In one part of the city, slogans hailed Stalin as a liberator. In another, cautious steps toward democracy were celebrated. Berlin was becoming two cities within one set of ruins. For civilians, the occupiers' differences were felt in daily life. In the East, food came through collective distribution, rigid and controlled. In the West, relief packages from abroad occasionally appeared, flour-canned goods, powdered milk, sparking gratitude but also jealousy. Stories of care packages sent by German relatives in America spread like legend. Families who received them were envied, sometimes even targeted. Food was power, and in a starving city, it defined alliances and resentments alike. Despite hardship, cultural life revived in small but vital ways. Theater troupes staged plays in bombed-out halls, often classics, that resonated with themes of tragedy and survival. Musicians salvaged instruments and played concerts in churches stripped of glass and pews. Audiences, wrapped in coats against the cold, listened with rapt attention. These moments offered relief from despair, reminding Berliners that they were still human, not just survivors. The psychological wounds, however, remained raw. Women who had endured assaults rarely spoke of it, but the silence was heavy. Men who had fought or been prisoners returned to find their families gone, their homes destroyed, their city unrecognizable. Children grew up too quickly, shaped by hunger and loss. Diaries from the period are filled with alternating notes of hope and despair. Gratitude for a potato. One day, despair over another, death the next. Above all, Berlin lived in uncertainty. The Reich was gone, but no new Germany had yet taken its place. Would the Soviets dominate? Would the Western Allies leave? Would the city be rebuilt or remain a scar on Europe? No one knew. The ruins of Berlin were more than physical. They were symbolic of a world broken in two, awaiting its future. By 1947, Berlin had become the stage for a new struggle, no longer between Germans and Soviets, but between the former Allies themselves. The war was over, yet the ruins of the capital were now a pawn in a contest of ideology. The western sectors under American, British, and French control pushed cautiously toward economic revival. The Soviet sector pressed in the opposite direction, tightening political control and laying the groundwork for a socialist state. Berliners trapped in the middle felt the tension sharpen with each passing month. The physical hardships remained relentless. Hunger continued to haunt daily life. Rations fluctuated, often insufficient to sustain health. Children were thin, their growth stunted, their bellies bloated from malnutrition. Adults suffered from weakness, tuberculosis, and other diseases born of deprivation. Relief packages from the West, when they arrived, were treasured beyond measure. Powdered milk flour and canned goods treated as lifelines. In the Soviet zone, food was scarcer, still distributed according to loyalty and cooperation. Rumors spread that party members received more, while others went without. The black market flourished more than ever. Cigarettes, chocolate, and coffee defined wealth, not currency. Allied soldiers, American especially, became part of this economy, trading goods for German labor companionship or services. For many Berliners, survival depended on these exchanges, even when they carried stigma or shame. Survival left little room for pride. Amid deprivation, Berliners sought scraps of normality. Schools reopened in bombed-out classrooms, desks replaced by wooden planks balanced on bricks, teachers instructed by candlelight when power failed. Churches filled again, not only with prayer, but with community meals organized from relief donations. Theater, poetry, and music continued to surface in improbable places. An opera staged in a half-destroyed hall, a play performed on a makeshift stage. These fragile cultural sparks gave meaning to lives otherwise consumed by hunger and rubble. Politically, divisions hardened. In the East, communists eliminated rivals, absorbing socialist groups into a single party under Soviet control. Posters of Stalin loomed over streets, promising renewal through socialism. In the West, parties competed openly, and press freedom returned in limited form. Yet the contrast between zones grew sharper by the day. Berliners spoke of crossing from one world to another simply by stepping across a street. On one side, Western patrols handed out gum and chocolate. On the other, Soviet soldiers monitored conversations and questioned strangers. For many civilians, survival eclipsed ideology. They cared little whether the flag above them bore stars or hammers, only whether bread was available that day. Yet beneath the surface, the larger confrontation was undeniable. The Soviet Union intended Berlin to be proof of socialist triumph, while the West aimed to make it a showcase of democracy. The city was no longer simply the capital of a defeated Reich. It was becoming the first battlefield of the Cold War. Berliners sensed this shift. Some whispered that another conflict was inevitable, that tanks might one day roll again through their streets. Others simply carried on, sweeping rubble, lining up for rations, and bartering in markets. The war was past, but its shadow remained heavy, stretching into a new uncertain future. By 1948, Berlin was both a ruin and a symbol. The scars of war remained visible everywhere: skeletal buildings, cratered streets, and families still living in cellars. But now, the city had become the front line of a new conflict. The Soviets tightened control in the east, while the Americans, British and French, worked to rebuild the west. Berlin, once Hitler's capital, was now the clearest fault line between two worlds. The immediate challenge was survival. Rations remained inadequate, and hunger still haunted the population. Western aid flowed more reliably, but shortages were constant. The black market continued to thrive, its stalls crowded with bartering, Berliners trading jewelry coats or tools for flour, potatoes, or cigarettes. In the Soviet zone, food was even scarcer. People whispered of favoritism of supplies, given only to party loyalists, while others starved. The bitterness of survival deepened old wounds. Amid deprivation, rebuilding continued. Rubble women still cleared bricks, their endless labor shaping mountains of debris on the city's edges. Makeshift homes arose from scavenged materials. Schools reopened in repaired classrooms. Children sitting at rough wooden benches, reciting lessons while staring at walls pockmarked by shrapnel. Churches and theaters drew small but hopeful crowds. Cultural life, though fragile, had returned enough to remind Berliners that they were more than survivors. But politics overshadowed daily existence. In June 1948, the Western Allies introduced a new currency in their zones, the Deutsche Mark. The move promised stability, but for the Soviets it was a provocation. Days later, they cut off all land and rail access to West Berlin, seeking to starve the western sectors into submission. Electricity was cut, goods blocked, fuel supplies stopped. The city that had already endured starvation now faced it again. The Western Allies responded with the Berlin airlift. From airfields in West Germany, American and British planes flew day and night, landing at Tempelhof and Gatow every few minutes. Flour, coal, milk, and medicine poured in from the sky. Children watched in awe as candy bombers dropped chocolate bars attached to parachutes. For Berliners, the drone of aircraft became the sound of survival. For the world, the airlift became the defining symbol of resolve, proof that the West would not abandon Berlin to Soviet control. By the time the blockade ended, in May 1949, nearly a year later, over 2 million tons of supplies had been delivered by air. Berlin had survived once again, not by miracle weapons or desperate defenses, but through the endurance of its people and the commitment of its new protectors. The ruins of 1945 had given way to a divided city, one half under Soviet authority, the other under Western protection. Berlin was no longer the capital of a Reich, but the centerpiece of a new struggle. The Battle of Berlin had ended the Second World War. The blockade of Berlin had begun the Cold War. From the ashes of total defeat, the city had become the stage for history's next great conflict, a divided Berlin standing as both warning and symbol for generations to come.